All right, well, let's continue on with the program now. We have a quick video, and then we'll get to Kimberley. But first, I did want to recognize a couple of folks, namely our board members who I have the great pleasure of serving every day, and some of them have been great mentors to me in my time here at TPPF. Obviously it all starts with Tim Lyles, our board chair. I saw him around here somewhere, so I know he's around. Doug Deason, and of course my colleague and his wife, Jackie Deason. It's great having them. Kevin Sparks, who was up here earlier. Chaz Neely, another great and proud Aggie. So it's good to see him. And I'm sure there's a few others. I haven't seen everyone this morning. But I just wanted to make sure that we recognize them and their work. So thank you. All right, so next we have a video that we've prepared for the benefit of those that might be a little unfamiliar with TPPF. I know most people in this crowd are. But the fact is, TPPF has made a real difference in Texas families through supporting, smart legislation, effective policies, and more efficient government. We don't try to judge ourselves based on, policy wins and losses, but on people we actually help. And so when we look at some of our criminal justice efforts and some of our healthcare efforts and education efforts, it's the people that we're focusing on. And that is why we fight every day. So as you watch the video, I hope you realize that Texas, because of our work, it's maybe a little easier to find a doctor who has time to see you, maybe a little easier to pay your property taxes, thanks to some of the great work last session. Yes, yeah. As a homeowner, I'm very appreciative of that. Your electricity is more dependable and affordable, thanks to Jason and Life Powered crew. And as a parent, you have more choices in how your children are educated in Texas. And our work to make life just a little better in Texas and U.S. continues. So please enjoy the video.
When your first name is Texas, you have a big mission to fulfill. For more than 30 years, the Texas Public Policy Foundation has pursued goals as big as the Lone Star State on behalf of Texans and beyond. Our victories include transforming the state from a judicial hellhole to one where doctors can afford to practice medicine. We pioneered conservative criminal justice reform, making Texas the unexpected reform leader. And we have since spread that model to 38 states and now to the federal prison system through the First Step Act. We defined what a conservative Texas budget would actually look like and held our leaders accountable to it. In 2011, when lawmakers wanted to raid the rainy day fund to permanently expand government, we took the case directly to Texans, and lawmakers changed their plans. We founded the 10th Amendment Action Center, and its first director was a young conservative leader by the name of Ted Cruz. The 10th Amendment Action Center, now called States Trust, has gone on to big things in the name of state solutions. Despite relentless attacks on education freedom, we have protected charter schools and the opportunities they provide to Texas's neediest students. We've gone beyond legislation and are claiming victories for liberty in litigation, using the courts to defend independent business owners from local government retaliation and directly challenging Obamacare. We have successfully fought to tell the real story behind American energy and are raising the nation's energy IQ. We have a headquarters in Austin, a growing office in D.C., and a presence in more than a dozen states. We're the biggest state-based think tank in the U.S., and we got here through three things: our research, our people, and our ideas. The Texas Public Policy Foundation, with a vision and influence as big as Texas.
All right, thank you. Well, now it's time for the main event, which is Kimberley Strassel. I have to say, I was just talking to Kevin's wife, Michelle, and sometimes when you enjoy someone's work so much, which I enjoy Kimberly's writing, her book. If you haven't read her latest book, Resistance at All Costs, you should. When you meet them, you hope that they live up to all expectations, and she is an absolute delight, and we are so privileged to have her here today. Kimberley, as you probably know, is a member of the editorial board at the Wall Street Journal. She's been at the editorial board since 2005. She actually started her career at Dow Jones and Company in '94 before moving on to the Wall Street Journal, where she worked in the Brussels and London branches. And obviously, you've probably seen her on many of the Sunday morning talk shows and things like that, like Face the Nation, Fox News, and Meet the Press. As I mentioned, Kimberley is the author of 2 New York Times bestsellers, The Intimidation Game and Resistance at All Costs. She's an Oregon native, but earned her bachelor's degree in public policy from the former Woodrow Wilson School of Public Policy at Princeton. And most importantly, she currently lives in Alaska with her husband and 3 children. So please help me in welcoming Kimberley Strassel.
Good morning. Day 2, right? You know, I actually, I've reached that age, so excuse me. There are so many reasons that I am happy to be here. And first of all, is that it is simply great to be out and about. A lot of things have been canceled this year, and I applaud this group's willingness to get back and have some form of normalcy, get together. Your weather makes it even better. As Greg just mentioned, I come from the only state that's actually bigger than Texas. I know, I just had to throw that in there, okay. And it's been a very long time since I have been in any temperatures that were anywhere close above freezing. So this is very exciting to me. But mostly, I think why I'm happy to be here, when I get asked to go speak to different groups, and I do get asked a lot and go to different types of groups all the time, the ones that I'm always the most passionate about are, in fact, state-based think tanks. And I'll tell you why. It might seem strange for me to say this because I spend my time watching Washington, but I think we spend too much time watching Washington. We forget that in our federalist system, which is one of the most amazing systems ever created in government, our first and closest unit of government is our state government. And having groups that remind citizens all the time of that and keep them informed and engage in those state policy debates, these are the groups that, in my mind, are on the front lines of our representative Republican democracy. So I applaud all of you. I'm really honored to be here. I can't believe I'm sharing a day with both Ron DeSantis and Greg Abbott. And I thank you for all that you do. So in advance, thanks for having me. I always like to just start by explaining what I'm going to be talking about. That way you can all sit there and know that it will come to an end at some point. I'm not one of those speakers where they're like, when is she going to get to the point? But I want to talk a little bit today about how we got to the moment we are at right now, the anger that is coursing through so many people on our side of the political aisle. And I also, because I think it's just really important that those of us who spend a great deal of time thinking about institutions and thinking about policy make the correct diagnosis of the problems that we have and how we got to where we are. And then I want to talk a little bit about what we can do about all that, how we can fix things, because this is also what we do. You know, we don't just get angry, we don't go out and engage in violence. When we see problems, we go out there and we fix them. And I think it's most important right now, when you are angry, to remember that this is why we exist, to go and solve the problems that are out there. So, how did we get to this moment? How did we get to a moment where we saw something like we saw last week? And I have to tell you, I count me as just a little amused by all my media brethren right now who are expressing surprise at this level of frustration. Because what cosmos have they been living in? Especially because they played a huge role, a foundational role in that frustration that you see out there. And especially because in contrast to the narrative that they are putting out at the moment, that this anger just bubbled up as as a result of the election, that it all began on November 4th. That's not true. It's been building for a very long time. And it's born out of the belief, and it's a founded belief, that we have a government that for some time now has not been operating under the principles of equal rights and equal justice. Rather, there is two standards of justice and one that doesn't rise to the level when it comes to conservatives. And where to even start to lay out those examples, okay? The entire press corps right now seems to be appalled that anyone is questioning the results of the election. Okay, and by the way, I happen to believe in the peaceful transfer of power, but I would nonetheless remind my media colleagues that these are the same people that spent the past 3 years attempting to overturn the results of the last election. So it's a little bit hard sometimes when you hear people on TV talking about conspiracy theorists, when in fact, one of the biggest conspiracy theorists in the entire nation, a guy named Jim Comey, they put on TV all the time. So that is one of the things that's caused frustration. We watched by as the awesome power of federal law enforcement in essence attempted a coup against a duly elected president. The FBI took a falsified dossier written by a foreign citizen, commissioned by the Democratic Party and one candidate for the presidency, and used it to investigate a Republican presidential campaign. They told untruths to a foreign intelligence surveillance court to get permission to listen in on that campaign. They used confidential human sources to spy on individuals in that campaign. And then when they were caught, rather than standing down or fessing up, they engineered a special counsel that dogged the presidency, brought unjust prosecutions, and tried, in the end, to push the president out over bogus obstruction of justice charges. Okay, these were FBI and DOJ employees. They're supposed to fairly administer the law, and you just have to laugh at it. We watched a federal bureaucracy over the last 4 years leak defamatory information to undermine the administration's agenda. We've watched federal judges join the resistance, imposing national injunctions, refusing to honor longstanding jurisprudence such as deference to the executive branch. We watched the Senate ambush a good and honorable Supreme Court nominee, Brett Kavanaugh, sliming him with unfounded accusations and demolishing the concept of due process. We watched the House pervert the solemn tool of impeachment, engaging in months-long secret depositions and hearings, and ginning up impeachment charges that had no basis in actual law. We've watched the press, the people I work with every day, completely abdicate their professional responsibilities, becoming partisans in political attacks against Republicans. And most recently, we've watched that same press that has a duty to inform the public, that exists to inform the public, sit on vital information about Joe Biden's family business dealings, his son Hunter, in the run-up to the election, in part to make sure that one side won. So that's everything you have just getting up to November 3rd, Election Day. And then, of course, there is the election itself. And I want to take a minute and give you my own view of what went wrong in the presidential election for conservative candidates this year, in particular in the presidential race. And I want to be really upfront that my analysis may not be exactly the same as some in this audience or some who are viewing. But again, in the interest of pointing out what I think are real problems, problems that we know about, that are on the record, that are right in front of our faces, it's really important to lay this out. Now, there have obviously been a multitude of claims of outright fraud in November. All I know is this: we have a system in which we can contest election results by demanding recounts, by going to courts, by appealing those court decisions, even by having state legislatures intervene. The Trump campaign had every right to engage in that process, and some of us, in fact, felt it had a duty to go and investigate these claims, given the extraordinary and unprecedented changes to voting rules that we had in the run-up to the election. It did, and it turns out it was unable to provide evidence enough to convince any judge, by the way, including judges appointed by Mr. Trump himself, or any appellate judge to change the results. And there was indeed evidence heard in more than about 50 cases. It was also unable to convince any state legislature, including states with all Republican legislatures, to overturn their state's election results. I can also tell you, and I know because I spoke to people there, the Department of Justice did look into a lot of this. They were unable to find, again, any fraud widespread enough to change the outcome. Now, do a lot of people doubt all this? Do they think the system is rigged? Undoubtedly. And it's partly because of all of those institutional biases and failures that I mentioned earlier. But at the same time, we are a country of rule and law. We are a country of processes, and this is where we have landed. The only alternative to accepting this reality is mob rule, and no one should want that, no matter how disappointed we are in the results. And yet, for all that people do not know, for all that people don't trust, there is a great deal we do know, and it's very problematic. And by means of getting to that, let me just take you back about 2 years. This is really important. 2 years ago, Nancy Pelosi retook the gavel in the House after successfully winning the 2018 midterms. And her first move was extremely revealing. Whenever there's a new Congress, and many of you probably know this, the majority introduces something called House Resolution 1, or H.R. 1. It is both substantive and it's symbolic. It's the majority laying out its very first bill, its top priority for the party and for the session. Now, if you go back and you remember 2018, Nancy Pelosi's Democrats campaigned on a great deal of issues, many of them longtime Democratic priorities. So you might have thought that Nancy Pelosi's H.R. 1, laid out in the beginning of 2019, would be a focus on, say, healthcare reform, or climate legislation, or immigration reform, or student debt, or any of the things that her people had in fact campaigned on all through 2018. It wasn't. Nancy Pelosi's H.R. 1 was a bill called the For the People Act. And it was a bill entirely focused on changing voting rules and then new restrictions on free speech, or what Democrats like to call campaign finance reform. The bill required every state to offer early voting. It also required every state to institute online voter registration and same-day voter registration. It required states to automatically register anyone who was ever in a government database. So if you'd ever received federal welfare or you'd ever interacted with your state DMV, you would automatically be put on the voter rolls. It required every state to offer no-fault absentee ballots, meaning mail-in votes for anyone who wanted it in every state. It required prepaid postage for all federal ballots. It turned colleges and universities into voter registration hubs, gave 16-year-olds the right to pre-register to vote 2 years before they were eligible. It also left in place all of those ballot harvesting rules that you've heard about that have become common in places like California. And for anyone who doesn't know, these are laws that allows individuals, often paid individuals, to collect ballots from other people and turn them in. And it stripped from states the right to engage in valid voter ID rules or to scour their electoral rolls for fraudsters or deceased individuals or ineligible voters. Once you were on the rolls, you stay on the rolls. And those were just the provisions in the bill dealing with ballots. The bill also eliminated the right of state legislatures to draw their own congressional lines. Every state would instead be ruled by an independent commission of the type that, as we've seen in other states, always tends to favor Democratic districts. It revamped the Federal Election Commission, making it so that there were only 5 members on it instead of 6, making it easier to go after anyone engaging in free speech. It also contained a slew of new disclosure rules, including ones that would require groups that had donors over $10,000 to put their names out in public. the better for the progressive left to harass them and intimidate them or cancel them. So ask yourself this. Why would Nancy Pelosi put together a bill like this? Why would she make it her top priority? Why strip voting authority from the states, where it's always existed in the past? Why include provisions that are arguably unconstitutional? Why include provisions that even many on the left, groups like the ACLU, objected to? And there is, of course, a very easy answer, because this bill was a brass knuckle effort to cement Democratic political control forever. It was designed to grease the skids for enrolling more Democratic voters, to enhancing Democratic turnout, and to destroy any effort at ballot integrity. This was their first priority, maintaining control. Mrs. Pelosi managed to pass this bill through the House, but obviously it didn't go anywhere because of Mitch McConnell's Senate. Here's the rub, though. Lucky for Mrs. Pelosi, along came this thing called the pandemic. And it was the excuse Democrats needed across the country to impose all of these new voting rules anyway. States everywhere, even some Republican states, watered down voter registration and voting rules. All mail-in voting, despite having had no experience with that before. Late deadlines, ballot harvesting, the end of witnesses for absentee ballots, curbside voting, same-day registration. And these changes didn't just happen by accident, I would point out. Within weeks of the pandemic really getting rolling in this country, Democratic law firms and Democratic groups had launched hundreds of lawsuits across the country demanding these kinds of changes. And they knew exactly what they were asking for, and for the most part, they got what they wanted. Republicans went out and fought some of them. They did win some battles, but they lost a lot. And it didn't happen in the vacuum on the ground either. This is also important. You know, Democrats knew what changes they were asking for because they have had groups for the past decades utilizing tools like this in places like California for a long time. There are entire outfits that exist to use these watered-down rules to sign people up and to push them to the polls. So my point here is, Republicans got out-hustled months before anyone even went to vote on election day. Okay? And because we don't have all those groups. We don't have that whole infrastructure. That's not how we do elections, conservatives. So even as all these changes were going to affect, we had a lot of Republicans out there continuing to just complain about the changes and complain about ballot integrity and to tell their own people, don't engage in mail-in balloting, just go to the polls on the day. And by the way, conservatives did go to the polls on the day, and they turned out. But in the end, thanks to a lot of these changes in the rules, the left turned out more people because the rules have been designed to allow them to do that. And that's how you get the end results that we got on that day. It's the only thing that really makes a lot of sense. That's how you get 74 million people voting for Donald Trump, significantly more voters than any sitting president in history. But it's also how you get 81 million people voting for Joe Biden. And none of this is disputed, okay? It's out there. Go look up the lawsuits, look up the rule changes. Go look up all of the very informative stories that ran before the election about Democratic groups setting up on college campuses and turbo-enrolling kids and collecting ballots. Go read the stories about liberal outfits who were micro-targeting and sending out millions of ballot applications in states where they'd got all mail-in voting authorized. By the way, only sending ballot applications to Democratic voters. They knew exactly what they were doing. And this is all highly relevant because guess what? Nancy Pelosi just began a new session, a new Congress, and she just introduced a new H.R. 1. And does anyone want to guess what it is? It's the same bill. She introduced it last week because Democrats understand that, God willing, we are soon going to get this pandemic under control, and so states won't as easily be able to get around their state voting laws, ones that are on the books. So her very first priority is to pass a bill that will allow the federal government to mandate these changes from the top and in perpetuity. Having barely managed to re-win control, Mrs. Pelosi's top priority is to keep control by shifting the rules to give Democrats an advantage out on the playing field. As an aside, and just to back up this point about a priority of keeping control, the other bill that they introduced last week, and this is very telling, is the one that would give D.C. statehood. And 2 new Democratic senators, obviously. So conservatives are going to have to recognize this reality and be prepared to respond, to do something about it. And that's the case with all of these issues and problems and institutional biases I mentioned earlier. We can sit here and feel grievous indignation. We can continue to feel very angry about what happened back in November, but these are things we can't necessarily change. And so I'd argue the overwhelming focus of these past 6 weeks in that attitude, and that's sort of the posture we've had, being very angry. I think that we know where that gets us at times. You know, I argue very strongly that by focusing as much as we had over the past 6 weeks on what happened in the presidential results, one of the results is losing 2 Senate seats in Georgia, the only GOP check in Washington on Joe Biden. So the alternative to that anger, that meditation on the past, is to drill down into the challenges at hand and to do policy and political battle going forward. And to recognize that some of these challenges, by the way, are also long-term. They're not going to get fixed overnight. They're going to take real work, potentially years of it. And what does some of that look like? How do we fix some of this mess? Look, on the good news, I think, on the election front, there is this immediate urgency of the Pelosi bill. It's a frontal assault on states' rights, but at least we know that. It was never going to go anywhere in Mr. McConnell's Senate, but now we have a Schumer Senate, and we should all be thinking very hard of that. Groups and voters need to be organizing right now pressure campaigns on Democratic House and Senate members, forcing them to explain and to justify why they would ever vote for a bill that undermines their own state's authority to set its election laws. Mrs. Pelosi doesn't have that big of a majority anymore. She's lost a significant number of seats. The Senate control also hangs on a knife's edge. So progressives cannot enact this power play if enough Democrats break from their marching orders. And given the radical nature of this bill, that should be achievable with enough pressure. Assuming that bill can be stopped, I think conservative and libertarian groups need to be reevaluating their own state election laws with an eye on ballot integrity. There needs to be movements to stomp out ballot harvesting. We need to reevaluate mail-in voting. I think we also need a review of what I would call laws governing civic engagement. You know, I'll tell you, I love pretty much everything about Texas, but I do not understand your early voting laws. I do not get it. In this last election, it so happens that very few people in America had even heard Joe Biden talk about his agenda until about 10 days out, when Donald Trump finally forced him out of his basement and made him answer some questions in the second debate. You people had already been voting for 10 days at that point. Do you know the most common search term in the 2 days following that final debate? How do I change my vote? So maybe we should all be thinking about, instead of having election month or election year, maybe we should get back to election day. And maybe we should put some more emphasis on making sure that people have to put at least as much effort into voting as they do going down to get a 6-pack of beer. What about some of the other abuses of power that I mentioned earlier? The FBI, judges, bureaucracy, media. There are fixes to these too. And some of them, by the way, are already underway. I know that Attorney General Bill Barr frustrated some people as he was exiting office, given his announcement on election results. But count me as a fan, I will tell you. And here's why. As someone who, for my sins, have had to spend the past 3 years writing about the epic Russia collusion hoax, I can assure you that nobody has done more to actually restore some rules integrity to the Department of Justice. Bill Barr instituted new provisions that, for instance, bar the FBI from starting sensitive political investigations without the express authority of the Attorney General. He's tightened up requirements for going to get wiretapping authority against Americans from the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. He had the bravery to withdraw charges against Michael Flynn and to send a message to line prosecutors that they are not gods and that they will get called out if they abuse their authority. I think most importantly, he appointed U.S. Attorney John Durham to investigate what happened in 2016 and then later elevated him to special counsel to help ensure that a President Biden could not easily get rid of him. His report is forthcoming. I think there will be prosecutions. I think that there's also going to be a raft of proposed changes to ensure that this doesn't happen again. I think it's going to be very difficult for an incoming AG to in any way deep six this report or to ignore some of those recommendations. And I know that all of that, a report, isn't necessarily going to satisfy some who think that the only measure of accountability in this is whether or not Jim Comey goes to jail in a jumpsuit, okay? But I think, again, as conservatives, free marketers who care about identifying problems, finding solutions to them, and making sure bad things don't happen anymore, we have made some real progress here, and it needs to continue to be the goal. Judges, resistance judges. I think we're about to see a big change there, too. For too long, we've had a 5-4 split on the Supreme Court that's resulted in the High Court dodging important cases or issuing narrow or confused rulings as John Roberts attempted to guard the reputation of his court. Thanks to President Trump, that balance is now 6-3. And I hope we're about to see a much more emboldened High Court, one willing to take up tough issues, and one willing to rebuke lower court justices that exceed their authority. But again, this challenge isn't over. Next year, just next year, I can't believe I'm saying this, it makes me tired just thinking about it, we have another election. Midterms. There's going to be an opportunity for Republicans to retake the House and the Senate, and this question of judicial nominees, of further creating a court system that hews to the Constitution, needs to be front and center in those campaigns. This is a long-term project. The federal bureaucracy, that's a tougher one, given the number of federal civil servants we know who all lean to the left. Pretty much if you are a Republican president and get in, you, these days, just assume that you're going to be sabotaged. I think it was more aggressive over the past 4 years than normal, but not necessarily out of keeping with what we've seen in the past. How do you fix that? Actually, interestingly, and it didn't get a lot of attention, the Trump administration did one very important thing to potentially try to change that situation. I don't know how many of you noticed it, but last year, the Agriculture Department mentioned that it was actually going to partially relocate to Kansas City. So if you wanted to get a different group, a mix of people in government, you want to get government back out among the folks that it actually serves, move it out of Washington. We should be campaigning for a lot of other agents and a lot of other pieces of the federal government to do the same. The Interior Department, for instance, get some of this out of Washington, get some fresh voices into Washington that's going to help balance out some of that bad behavior. The other thing we need to be focused on, and it was one of my regrets, the Trump administration did so many impressive policy achievements while they were there. The one I think that we missed out on was civil service reform. This needs to become a driving priority for conservative groups across the country, not just in the federal government, but at the state level too, okay? We need to have more rules in place that make clear to the bureaucracy that they work for the people of the United States of America and not the other way around. Okay, the media, okay. This is probably the most depressing part. Despite my best effort to be an optimist, I can't think of any way of fixing what has become that clown car of an industry. It's pretty appalling to watch. It's embarrassing to watch. Over the past 4 years, we have seen the media completely shred pretty much every standard, every basic principle it once hewed to. It has reported untruths, it has reported one-sidedly, it has reported anonymously, it has sat on stories, it has acted as a naked political partisan entity. I will say this, though. We are a nation of very opinionated consumers, and we vote, at least in many of our marketplaces, with our wallets. We also believe in competition. So with luck, if enough Americans abandon shoddy or biased media outlets, make the deliberate decision to put its money with trusted and honest ones, we'll see some changes there. Which brings us to one of the even bigger challenges, allowing that competition of viewpoints and news to happen. I think over the past week, we have seen the startling crackdown, the purge of conservative voices by big tech. And the issue of what to do about social media companies is now also going to have to become a driving priority. Think about it, the challenge that we just saw of this past week. US corporations suddenly set them up to be the arbiters of who can engage in political speech and activity. This is quite stunning. It's not something that we have ever seen in the history of this country before. And I'm not talking here about corporations deciding, for example, to stop giving donations to certain Republicans who objected to the election results. Corporations are under no obligation to give money to politicians on either side of the aisle. I'm talking about something very different, unprecedented. I'm talking about every major social media platform removing the sitting president of the United States, silencing entire outlets. I'm talking about a company called Stripe, one of the largest online processors of financial transactions, announcing that it would no longer process campaign donations to the Trump campaign. I'm talking about Campaign Monitor, an email processing firm that's also refused to send any emails from the Trump campaign. I'm talking about Shopify, removing the Trump campaign sites that sell items. These are US corporations that are now refusing to provide what have become the backbone services that make up US political activity and speech in the United States. This is corporate America exercising its power to cancel politicians, groups, maybe even entire political parties that happen to offend their woke sensibilities. It is unprecedented, and as a result, it brings up some profound new questions. There was a time, maybe even a week ago, that these organizations could say, well, you know what? We're private companies. We get to choose who we serve, what we sell, who we ban. But coming, as all of this does, on the back of Democrats taking full control of Washington, and coming, as it does, in an entirely one-sided way against just one side of the aisle, this raises the specter, the possibility that corporations have been captured or coerced by the Democratic Party, and as a result are operating not really as private organizations, but as arms of the state, with the end goal of one-party rule in Washington. And that means that we have to look at it very differently. I would also point out that the remedy that has always existed up to now in a situation like this, that we've always turned to when you see corporations step beyond their boundaries, is suddenly no remedy at all, and that was highlighted for us this week. In the past, companies have said, hey, if you don't like what we're offering, if you don't like our business practices, go somewhere else, set up your own deal. Which, by the way, is exactly what conservatives did after Twitter started banning and labeling and shadow banning conservatives on their site. They set up something called Parler. And yet, just a few days ago, these organizations shut down that avenue too, refusing to provide Parler's app, refusing to host it in the cloud. And I would point out that the real drama of this week isn't just what they've done, but what it proves that they can do in the future, okay? Right now, these groups all have their excuses for why they've done what they've done. They're claiming that they need to take these actions so that they can stop any more potential violence, all right? But if you can shut down the President of the United States, what won't you do? How long before email carriers say they aren't going to send any emails that dispute global warming? How long before Amazon says it won't sell or ship any books that support tax cuts or entitlement reform? How long before an online financial processing firm says it won't handle the credit card transactions of any American with an active Parler account? This is unprecedented, and I would note the extraordinary silence from Democrats who only a few years ago went all the way to the Supreme Court over their complaints that one baker somewhere wouldn't make a cake for a gay marriage. But suddenly, they're totally fine with the most powerful corporations in the country withholding their services to millions of Americans. These are constitutional and antitrust questions that are going to have to be addressed by the courts, by the political pressure, by action, by people in this room. And all of these ongoing challenges I mentioned are going to have to be balanced with other immediate ones. The immediate challenge of an all-Democrat-controlled Washington. We're about to engage in some epic fights about not just voting laws, but tax hikes, climate and green energy policy, student debt, banking rules, border policy, trade, union rules. Every one of these is going to be a huge fight, all the more so because of the very narrow majorities in both the House and the Senate. That's good news, in a way. These are fights that, for those of us who believe in free markets and free people, we still have an opportunity to win. But again, only if we focus on the challenges at hand and focus forward. One of the consequences, in my mind, of the many institutional attacks, specifically on President Trump in recent years, is it has driven a lot of people in the conservative base to feel very impassioned about defending him personally, to make him a rallying point. And I think some of that is because people really believed in this president. But a lot, I think, too, and I've spoken with a lot of Americans, a lot of it's because many of them felt that attacks on him were attacks on everyone on the right. Whatever the reason for all of this, it's resulted in this kind of unusual situation in which we've had an elevated level of focus on a particular person rather than policy. My point, we're going to get a chance to reevaluate all those personalities again in 4 years, because we're going to have the party's political primaries. And believe me, no one's going to miss it, especially if Donald Trump is out there. You're going to hear about it, and you're going to be engaged in it. But in the intervening time, the challenge is going to have to be on the policy front. The challenge is in thinking deep and hard about these institutions, about how to get them back to a place where they treat all Americans under a single standard. The challenge is this immediate policy fights I'm telling you about that are coming in the next few months and that go to the heart of how average Americans live their lives every day, the taxes they pay, the cost of doing business, the quality of their health care, the quality of their kids' education. We have an obligation to be geared up and united and engaged in those battles, not just in Washington, but at a state level too. So we can spend the next months and years thinking about what happened, tearing each other up over our differences, having arguments about loyalty and whether or not people did enough or how you view these things. And believe me, our friends on the left side of the aisle, they would love nothing more than for us to do that. And they're going to be busy imposing their own purity tests. They'd love it too, because here's the funny thing. The real story of the past decade hasn't been about arguments on the right. It's been about this growing split on the left in the Democratic Party. Conservatives might be fractured right now over elections and personalities, but I promise if I locked 100 of you in a room, 99 would agree on most basic policy and constitutional principles. If I locked 100 Democrats in a room, you'd be lucky if one came out alive at the end. That division should be the reigning story of these coming years. That division should be an opportunity to stop some of the worst progressive ideas that are now being debated out there. But again, only if we who believe in free markets and free people are focused on the challenges, the policy challenges, and we're ready to go. And that is why I am so happy. I get up in the morning and I'm so thrilled to know that there are groups like the Texas Public Policy Foundation who are always eager and ready to join those fights. And I can't thank you enough for having me here today, for taking the time to so graciously listen to me in these remarks. I look forward to getting to do it again at some time when we can even be in a little bit more closer proximity without the mass. And again, thank you for all you do.
Wow, thank you, Kimberly. That was fantastic. I did fail at one of my most important job as MC, and that was to recognize the sponsor who made today's breakfast possible, and that's Semper Energy. So thank you, Semper Energy, so much for bringing us Kimberly and making this possible. So as we close today, again, Kimberly, that was fantastic, and I think a great start to our day. And I think it's incumbent upon us to remember that there's currently an immense pressure on and duty on all of us to examine our roles in civil society and the erosion of trust that has consumed our institutions that Kimberly pointed out. Whatever you thought of the protests and riots this summer or last week, it behooves us all as those who seek a more prosperous union to understand the fear, the rage, and the helplessness that many feel. When I think about how we solve that as a foundation and how we chart a path ahead, I think a lot about some marriage advice that I got when I was early on, and it was simple. It was to turn in, right? So if there's discord, miscommunication, etc. in my marriage, I was told turn in. It's very hard for me. Someone who always assumes that they're right. My wife will obviously tell you that I'm usually not. By doing that, having those hard conversations, being vulnerable, listening, and being willing to change my mind, I've made my marriage stronger. And I think if we can do that with each other, if you look at the conservative movement that feels very fractured in this moment in time, but I think Kimberly was right that we really agree on far more than we disagree on. And I think if we take the time and turn into each other, that we can start charting the path forward. And so that's what I would encourage you all to do as we start our day. And I'm quite confident that, even though these are troubled times, that we will get through that. Churchill told us that, optimists find great opportunity and great difficulty. And this is a room full of optimists, so I'm very hopeful that we will seize the opportunity in front of us, even though we recognize the hard work and the hard choices that we'll have to make. So as we close out today, just remember, here at TPPF, we follow some certain ideals, and Nelson Mandela said that our choices should reflect our hopes and not our fears. And I think that's how we operate every day here at the foundation. And that is how we will operate as we have to make some tough choices and move forward as a movement ahead. So I thank you all for being here today, and I hope you have a great day and a great morning. So God bless you, and God bless Texas.